wanted to be an actress. So I would say in different voices, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, just a second, who's calling? Not knowing that Strickling was there. I didn't know that he was right around the corner. And I said, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, just a second, darling, who's calling? And he started to laugh. He came over, he had tears in his eyes, and he said, I don't mind you doing that. That's okay. He says, do you do anything else? I said, well, I write. So he said, would you like to become a writer for us? I said, I would love it. If I could be a judge, I'd say the most beautiful woman in the world. Her complexion was like a typical English, beautiful skin. Vivacious, charming. When we knew her, she was going with Mickey Rooney, and we would have lunch at the drugstore downstairs. Ava was especially excited about her meetings with Mickey Rooney at the time, so she wanted to talk it over with us. So we went down to the drugstore, and we sat there, and if you could have heard what went on and what we said, it's a good thing there were no microphones there.
The way that I met Ted Turner was he was a guest speaker at the caucus when he had just bought MGM. And a fellow named David Levy said, come on over, I'd like to introduce you to Ted Turner. Because I said, well, yeah, fine, I'd love to meet him. So I go over there, and he said, David, this is Andrew Fenady. And he said, Fenady, the rebel? And I said, yes, sir. He said, just a second. He jumped on a chair and started singing, Johnny Yuma was a rebel. He knew the whole damn lyrics. He said, it's my favorite Western, it's my favorite song. I said, well, you know, I wrote it. He said, you wrote Johnny Yuma was a rebel? I said, yeah. He said, come and see my man Jack Petrick tomorrow. And he introduced me to Petrick. He was there that night. He said, come on out to MGM, we're gonna make some pictures together. And I'm driving the Cadillac in my three-piece suit, and I just pull up for a stop sign. And 3 or 4 little kids are going by. So I wave them on. They're walking and they're looking at me, and they're looking at the car and they're looking at me. Really made an impression on these little squirts. And one of the kids, before he got to the other side, says, hey, mister. And I said, yeah, what is it, son? He says, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah, what do you want to know? He said, are you a chauffeur? I said, get out of here, you. And that happened in Culver City.
There isn't anyone any more talented than Donald O'Connor. He was, the first movie I did was Mr. Big with him, and he was 17. And he had to go to school. And I was 19 or 20, and I didn't have to go to school. And he thought I was pretty hot stuff.
A lot of times on the Roach lot, they would be, filming 2 or 3 things that's really close together. The gang would be shooting on one side, and then over there, Laurel and Hardy would be doing it. Mother always thought they were kind of naughty men.
They were too risque?
I think that's what it was.
He used to get upset with Mr. Selznick because Mr. Selznick always kept writing, trying to add more and stuff. No script was ever final for him. My brother just said every day he rewrote stuff and rewrote, and the actors went crazy, so it was a very unhappy set.
It was my brother that had to go down and talk to Shirley's mother, Mrs. Temple, to kind of keep calming her down, because she and Shirley were having words together, and every morning my brother said he hated to go to work because he knew he was going to have to go down and settle the stars down and to settle Shirley down and with her mother, so that they could go on with the scenes. It certainly lighted the whole city of Culver City up. I just remember that I think that they notified all the residences of Culver City that there was going to be a big fire sequence, and it was very, very big. I went outside to see it. A lot of fire.
Oh, I don't know, there must have been 5 or 6 engine companies from LA, and then Culver City didn't have many, so we had 1 engine company there, but all the off-duty firemen were there. And we laid lines, and the prop makers, the special effects men, had gasoline lines laid into pipes, and they'd controlled by valves back off the set. And when they wanted to set it on fire, they'd turn the gasoline on and ignite it. And then they had to do it 3 times. We put it out twice. I remember one time they made Citizen Kane, and Orson Welles was there. And I wasn't on the department very long. And they sent me down there to stand by because they were going to have a fire on the set and they were going to turn the sprinkler. Went on that set and I was scared to death because they had this great big fireplace and Orson Welles was sitting there, and he was a somber looking guy anyway, you know, he's so different. And I thought, oh my God, what? And so I called the station. I said, they're going to shut these sprinklers off and they're going to have this fire here on the set. And they said, well, do the best you can and give us a call if you need be.
There was a pretty young lady trying to sing a song with us for a picture. And very timid. That was Grace Kelly for High Society. She had one little song to sing in there. Well, the worst one I've ever worked on is with Dmitri Tiomkin. And this was Duel in the Sun. He had a cue where Gregory Peck and Jennifer Jones, where they were fighting and he was trying to... So anyhow, he did this cue. And we played it. And again, 12 hours on that one cue. And Selznick didn't like it and threw it out. We had to record something else.
When Ben started as an art director, and I don't know if they even had the term, because in some of the film magazines, they had different titles for him, technical director, all kinds of different titles. He was really a one-man art department. He would design the sets. He did have a couple of scenic artists to do the backings because they used a lot of painted scenery. But he would design the sets. He would go out and buy the dressings for the sets. He would dress the sets. He would design makeup, if there was any special makeup, like in Bluebird. He would design the makeup. If there were special costumes, he would often design the costumes. So he was like a whole one-man art department. But later on, of course, it became very much fragmented. And when he was art director on A Night at the Opera, the Marx Brothers' Night at the Opera, why, it was just like a whole city that was doing all the things that he used to do himself. His specialty was designing these huge backdrops, 100 feet long, 40 feet high, big scenic backgrounds, and nobody understood what he was doing because he worked by formulae. It was all very, very mathematical. He had many firsts to his credit. One of the first firsts was that he had, in 1922, he did a picture with about 30 seconds of color in it. It was called Old New York, I think, with Marion Davies. And at the very end of the picture, he had this very short sequence in color, two strip color, not 3 yet. He also did the first picture with sound, which was Barrymore, yes. Don Juan, and then the first talking picture, which was the jazz singer, because it had just that one spoken line in it. And then he did the first outdoor Western with sound, which was Rider of the Purple Sage. Barrymore was very fond of Ben. And Barrymore was a great trickster. And there was a scene where he breaks a goblet, a Venetian goblet. Ben had 12 of these goblets made special. Barrymore blew his lines on every take. And finally they were down to one goblet. And Crosland went over to Barrymore and said, Ben only has one more goblet, so you'd better have this take perfect. So that take was perfect.
I've always been more of an instructor. Anything in the Western line, guns, knives, bullwhips, roping, and they all come to me to the studios, always send them. And I've had, at the ranch in Culver City, I've had Zsa Gabor up there, Richard Egan, George Hamilton. They all would come up to the ranch there, because it's right there in Culver City, right close to the studios. And Robert Taylor, I've doubled Bob on his Billy the Kid, the first one, and was gun instructor for him. Glenn Ford. I was gun instructor for Glenn Ford on Fastest Gun Alive. For 10 years, I was practically under contract at MGM when I was teaching everyone to Joel McRae, Stars in My Crown, Deborah Carr, just you name it, and I worked with them practically. So I worked on every one for about 12 years, 11, 12 years, except the pilot. I didn't do the pilot on the Little House, but from then on I was on every one. You'll see me driving the stage, and I doubled everybody on everybody including the women on the show. I mean, it was really a home, as I say. And Mike was, well, he was a genius. He was still underestimated.
It's true. There are, I think, a few stars left who can still stop traffic. I mean, if I found I was walking down the street and Fred Astaire was coming my way, I would have to fight a temptation to genuflect. It's also damn good to get a sense of what the whole world is like, and the whole world that you may not know at first hand, but you get glimpses of what the real world is like. And it's very enriching and sobering.
I only heard Judy Garland talk about him once backstage at the Palace, but I got a whole different view of my grandfather from the way that she talked about him. You know? Some people use the word protective, other people use the word paternal. He was so concerned about not just the health and welfare of the people on the lot, but in terms of the stars, were they making the right marriage? Were they marrying somebody stupid? Were they marrying somebody who was only interested in their spouse for what they could get out of them? So he would analyze, in his own somewhat primitive way, what these people needed, and if they were about to marry the wrong person, he'd try to dissuade them. So there was, someone who didn't like his interference would speak very negatively of him. There were two totally different operations. MGM, of course, was a huge factory, and I saw my grandfather in charge of it, and as I say, there was this protective empire, and he was royalty. The two studios were similar only in that in each case I was related to the man in charge. Now at Selznick International, it was like I won't say a cottage industry, but it was a very small studio by comparison. There didn't seem to be any other producer on the lot besides my father. I think there must have been, but I felt this was his own little kingdom, and I felt much closer to it, not only because it was my father as opposed to my grandfather, but because it was like a family studio. Again, I felt that I might one day be there. Whereas when my grandfather said to me about the MGM lot, someday this will be yours, that seemed highly unlikely, because I couldn't imagine myself being a businessman and a tycoon and a mogul. I mean, he was all of these things, my grandfather.
And in comes Spielberg. And we chat for a few minutes, and I had 2 or 3 pages of my humble credits, and I showed it to him. And Spielberg looked at them for a few minutes, and he said, he's going to be I figured a much older man than you. And I said, well, Mr. Spielberg, here I am, but I'm an actor. And he said, all right, he said, I'd like you to do the part. And it's a low-key scene, and it's beautifully written, very beautifully written. And I have to say that because Spielberg had a hand in that. And I think he was delighted with it. And another thing was that being low-key, the rest of the film suffered by comparison, because with a film like Poltergeist, it had to move so fast that you couldn't pick out the flaws. You know what I mean? It had to move very, very fast. And that was really the basic character of the tone of the whole film, was thunder, sort of greased lightning sort of stuff. And then you come to this, and it slowed the whole action up. So he took it out, and he gave me a clip of the whole thing. One day Greer said to me, she said, "David, I notice you notice all these very pretty girls around here." And I said, "Yes, Greer, they are. They're beautiful. They're just great." And she said, "Let me tell you that every one of these girls belongs to someone in the executive branch here. And I advise you not to interfere." So I said, "Well, I never dreamed of anything like that." But I'll tell you an extraordinary thing about Flynn. If you met him and you knew him, you knew what his background was or what he was like or what he'd get up to in his shenanigans, you would be completely disarmed. He could take you in. You couldn't believe that this man had this other side to him, you know what I mean? And he had a animal magnetism on the screen. He didn't know how to act. He was himself. Absolutely himself, but it was a rarity.
Well, my father was a great fisherman, and a lot of times he'd come into the wharf and then he'd change and then sometimes go out on the wrecks. And I know one time he came home and told this story about how they boarded and then they started throwing the slot machines overboard. And I wonder what the environmentalists would think of that today. Well, I imagine divers have gone down many years ago and gotten those. And then because they didn't have the proper documents, then Tony Canero, sent them the other way, and they didn't finish the raid or whatever they called it. That this was a place for Hollywood celebrities just to get away from the public, to go out on the wrecks and enjoy gambling and so forth. Sometimes I'd sneak down on the stairs and I could look through into the living room, and all I could see was this dark cigar smoke coming out, terrible stench, and these people, laughing and working out the gags. And then my father would go to work very early and then again meet with them for the final go over what they were going to be shooting that next. They almost shot for us from day to day. They didn't go by scripts like they do today. That's all planned out way ahead and schedules and all. Everything was subject to change.
And I remember Gable one time at the Duck Lodge saying, "There's a rumor going around that you're going to try to be an actor." And I said, "Yeah, Clark, I thought I'd give it a shot." And he said, "Oh my God, we'll lose a great shot and wind up with a lousy actor." He said, No, okay, look, I'll tell you what. You're going to be an actor, you're going to be a pro. You're going to show up on time, know your lines, don't screw up the author's intent, and if you ever become a thing called a celebrity, a word that I hate, and you use that celebrity to push people around and make them unhappy, I'm going to kick you right in the butt. So, you learned, that was the way it was then. And so maybe I don't act like I think I'm something special, because if I do, he'll come down and kick me in the butt.
When we were off there in the jungle, I was in my little dressing cabin, and Michael Caine and some of the actors were listening on the shortwave radio to the Academy Awards. And I wasn't listening because I figured I wouldn't win, and I was in there getting ready for a scene. And all of a sudden, Michael almost broke the door down. He said, "You son of a..." He used that term. And he said, "You won the Academy Award." And the next thing I knew, they had me outside, and they're shooting me up in the air with a blanket, and they're yelling, and we had a pretty good party that night.
The man that I first went to work with at MGM, a man that most people have never heard of, was an extremely impressive executive. His name was Ray Clune, spelled K-L-U-N-E, and he had started in the business as a prop man. His first major job was as the production manager in Culver City of Gone with the Wind. And among other things, he directed some of the second unit work, including the fire on Gone with the Wind. He later became the executive in charge of production for David Selznick during all the years that the studio, now known as Culver Columbia, or Sony Culver, I guess it is, was then the Selznick Studios. Then he became head of production at 20th Century Fox under Darryl Zanuck, one of the great executives in the history of the business. They had hundreds of people under contract, hundreds of people that worked no place else. and were under the control of the studio. And it would be 50 or 60 actors and 20 or 25 directors and producers. It would include writers, it would include editors, and people literally were under the control of the studio. They did what they were told. If they didn't do what they were told, the studio could do without them. And if Spencer Tracy didn't want to do a picture, they'd simply call Clark Gable and say, be here on Monday, and he would be. Directors did not decide what pictures they directed. They were told what pictures they directed. They got 2 weeks to prepare a picture, sometimes 1 week. Now they take 6 months. The companies got smart enough to realize if they would put their corporate headquarters at the studios, then it would justify the existence of the studio. So you put your office building where all the corporate types operate on the studio lot. They can all interrelate with one another, they can all work with one another, and all of a sudden the studio makes sense again. The minute television came in, it was obvious that film libraries would be terribly important. I didn't know that home video was going to come in. I didn't know there was going to be cable or satellite projection or whatever else, and CD-ROM and all that sort of thing. But what I did see was that there would be markets for libraries of film indefinitely, that the cost of preserving them was minor compared to the cost of producing them, and therefore, from an artistic point of view, you shouldn't let them deteriorate. MGM, as I say, did have certain pride in its films. However, when I got there and started to tour the vaults where films were being stored, I found they were being stored in really what is basically concrete bunkers all over what was then lots 2 and 3, which were outdoor lots, and they were terribly hot, and they were not properly taken care of, and there were extensively valuable hoards of film in all these vaults. None of these vaults were refrigerated. So one of the first improvements that were made, not just because of me, but because I was able to convince others, was to build refrigerated vaults on what was then Lot 1. And move all that film out of these concrete bunkers and into these refrigerated vaults.